Hello, welcome back. In this session, my colleague Soumya, an expert in ISO and ISMS&ISO270001 standards, will explain what is ISMS. Soumya, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. A very bookish definition of ISMS states that ISM defines and manages controls that an organization needs to implement to ensure that it is sensibly protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of assets from threats and vulnerabilities. To understand this definition a little more in depth, let us look at each of these terms and what it means to us. Information assets. Information. Any meaningful data is called information. And an asset, anything that adds value to the organization, is an asset. For example, organization assets could contain digital assets, hardware assets, human assets, physical assets, paper-based assets, and intangible assets. Digital resources like files or the code, all kinds of digital information that we store in our system, that would be more of digital assets. Hardware assets, maybe you have your laptops, you have your servers, all those will come under hardware assets. Human assets, customers, us, the management team, any vendors that we interact with, all those come under human assets. Physical assets, chairs, desks, everything physical in your ACs, all physical assets in the organization will come under this category. Paper-based assets, maybe all kinds of information or contracts that we store in the form of paper comes under this particular paper-based asset. Intangible assets. Some examples of intangible assets could be the goodwill that the company has earned in the market. You would want to protect that, right? The processes defined in your organization, you would want to protect that also. Any innovations that you've made, any kind of intellectual property that you own, any knowledge or competence that you've built up over the years, all those are intangible assets that you would want to protect. So now that you understand what information assets are, let us look at the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of these information assets. This is called the CIA triad. And ISMS defines that we have to secure the CIA of these information assets. What is confidentiality? The property that information is not made available or disclosed to unauthorized individuals, entities, or processes. Is my communication private? Am I ensuring that the data is read only by the intended person? For example, I wouldn't want my salary slip to be visible and available to everybody in my organization, do I? Or I would want to keep important client shared documents confidential to the project team members. I wouldn't want it to be shared to other projects. Admin tax related information. A lot of information within an organization that you would want to make confidential and available only to specific users. The next term, integrity. The property of safeguarding the accuracy and completeness of assets is called integrity. Has my communication been altered? Can I ensure that my data is not modified by unauthorized people? All that comes under integrity. Now, confidentiality and integrity are very much tied to each other. Some ways in which I ensure integrity of my information is ensuring or implementing access permissions on maybe shared files in your Google Drive. We give only read permissions to certain people, right? And others we give write permissions. Why is that? Because we want to protect the integrity of that file. Whenever we share some kind of deliverable with the client, which we wouldn't want them to modify or alter, for example, the timeline, we do it in a PDF format. Why do we do that? Because we don't want them to modify or alter that. So that is how we ensure integrity. The third term is availability. The property of being accessible and usable upon demand by an authorized entity is called availability of information. Data should be available to the required people when they need it. That is also a key concept of the CIA triad of information security. How do we ensure that? We ensure that the networks have good bandwidth. And then one good example of where availability is compromised is a denial of service attack, where a malicious hacker, kind of like in your network, they put so much traffic that your network is overwhelmed and your website comes down and it is not available to the intended users. So that is availability. So now let us look at the next two terms, which is threats and vulnerability. is. Now we understood what is information assets, and we understood the properties associated with these information assets, which is thus confidentiality, integrity, and availability of those information assets. Now, what are threats and vulnerabilities? Threat is an unwanted event that could cause the deliberate or accidental loss, damage, or misuse of information assets. And vulnerability is a weakness or gap in your security program that can be exploited by these threats to gain unauthorized access to an asset. For example, in an organization, employees are very careless and they do not lock their system when they go out for breaks or when they leave for the day. They leave all kinds of notes and documents on the desk for anybody could take a look of these documents. Is that a threat? Definitely, I think you would agree that the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your project details or documents or whatever is definitely exposed. Now, what could be a vulnerability in this case? Vulnerability is that these employees are not aware. You do not have a policy called the clean desk policy in your organization where employees are educated that they are supposed to leave a clean desk. They are supposed to lock their system, or they are supposed to dispose of paper assets or any other document lying outside in a proper manner or keep it confidential. That could be a vulnerability. So some other threats and vulnerabilities that could affect our information assets is maybe theft, sabotage or misuse, hacking, virus threats on your network, unrestricted access into your development bay, system or network failure where there is no availability of information, there is no lack of documentation. In between the project, some developer has quit and left. Now the person who takes over does not know where to start from. Lack of documentation, right? Version control problems. Your releases are not properly version controlled. There is a big bug discovered in your production. You don't know how to go back to a previous version of your code. Natural calamities, cyclones, floods, earthquakes, all these could come under threats and vulnerabilities that could affect your information assets. So now that leads to, as Sujo mentioned, it leads to a term called risk. So threats and vulnerabilities lead to risk. Risk is the potential for loss, damage, or destruction of an asset as a result of a threat exploiting a vulnerability. Threat is something that can damage or destroy an asset. Vulnerability, a weakness or gap in your protection, and which leads to risk where assets, threats, and vulnerabilities intersect. The more information assets you have, the more are the threats and vulnerabilities, and the more is the risk associated with it, which is also leads to what the key essence of ISMS, which is managing the risks that your information assets are exposed to. So now we look at the last term in the definition, which is controls. So we understood what are information assets, CIA of information assets, the threats and vulnerabilities that can affect the information assets, the risks leading to those threats and assets. Now how do we control the risks? Controls are steps taken to tackle the risk arising because of these threats and vulnerabilities. For example, maintaining an access register or biometric sensor at the organization entrance, having firewalls protecting your private network, enabling password systems to access confidential digital information, having formal agreements with vendors and suppliers, background verification process for prospective employees, maintaining version control systems for coding, following coding standards, defining a proper SDLC methodology. These are some of the examples that organizations usually define as controls to reduce the risk on their information assets. Now, let us look at the need for ISMS. Why would an organization want to implement ISMS? Various reasons: safeguarding market reputation, ensuring business continuity, ensuring disaster recovery in case of some certain threat, avoid business loss, avoid loss of confidential data, avoid loss of customer confidence, and conform to legal liability. All these can be addressed effectively and efficiently only by establishing a proper information security management system. Thank you for your time and hope you enjoyed the session.
Thank you, Soumya. See you all in the next session.